The year was 1867, and Louisville wore its freedom like a fresh coat of paint. Bright enough to impress, thin enough to crack. Church bells rang with practiced cheer. Riverboats sighed against the docks, and men spoke of a new era, as if it had already arrived. Yet in a narrow house tucked behind a butcher's shop, the air never changed. It smelled of iron and damp wood, and the daylight came only as a rumor slipping through the seams of boarded windows. Patsy Minkins learned the shape of time there by counting footsteps overhead. They told her she was free. The word had floated down the stairs once, careless as dust, when the man who owned the house laughed with a visitor and said the war had settled all that business. Patsy held on to the sound of it. Free, turning it over in her mouth like a smooth stone. But the door at the top of the stairs remained locked, and the rules did not soften. She rose before dawn, worked until her hands trembled, and slept with the knowledge that no one would come looking if she disappeared into the dark between breaths. Above her, the city congratulated itself. Papers praised progress, officials signed proclamations, and sermons declared bondage a ghost of the past. Patsy listened to the clatter of dishes, the scrape of chairs, the ordinary music of lives allowed to unfold. Sometimes a laugh would break loose and tumble down to her, sharp enough to cut. It was then she understood the trick of it. Freedom had been declared, not delivered. On certain nights, when the river fog crept in and pressed against the walls like a living thing, Patsy imagined the city as a single, watching eye, wide open, unblinking, choosing not to see. She wondered how many people knew. How many had decided that silence was easier than truth? The chains that held her were no longer legal, but they were effective, forged from habit and fear, and the unspoken agreement that some lives could remain unfinished. Somewhere, ink dried on documents promising a different world. Somewhere, a ledger still bore her name under a column that should have been erased. And in the darkness beneath the butcher's shop, Patsy Minkins waited, breathing softly, for history to notice the space where its promise had failed. The discovery of the faded courthouse ledger becomes the quiet ignition of the entire story, because it exposes the distance between law and lived reality in a way that no speech or proclamation ever could. In a city eager to believe it had crossed cleanly from bondage into freedom, the ledger sits unnoticed on a shelf, its pages yellowed and soft, its ink bleeding slightly into the paper fibers. It is not dramatic in appearance, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes it terrifying. This book was once handled daily by clerks, judges, and officials who understood its authority, and even after abolition it continued to exist as a functional object rather than a relic. When the ledger is opened to the year 1867, 2 years after freedom was declared, the columns still bear familiar headings of ownership, labor value, and transfer, as if the war and its promises had never fully reached this room. The presence of Patsy Minkins' name under such a heading is not a mistake made by ignorance, but a residue of deliberate neglect, revealing how systems can continue operating long after their moral justification has supposedly died. What makes this moment especially unsettling is that the ledger does not scream its wrongdoing. There is no blood on the page, no confession written in the margins. Instead, the horror lies in its calm precision. Patsy's name is written with the same steady hand used for countless others before her, suggesting routine rather than outrage. The ink implies that someone sat at a desk, dipped a pen, and consciously recorded her existence as property at a time when the law publicly denied that possibility. This contradiction forces the reader to confront the idea that freedom, when declared from above, does not automatically dismantle the habits and incentives embedded below. The ledger becomes proof that abolition did not arrive as a clean break, but as a fragile idea vulnerable to being ignored wherever it inconvenienced those in power. The setting of a courthouse is equally important because it represents legitimacy and order. This is not a criminal's diary or a secret ledger hidden in a private home, but an official document housed in a public institution. Its survival signals that the state itself allowed the old language of ownership to linger, even if it no longer spoke it aloud. By keeping such records intact, the courthouse becomes a silent accomplice, offering structure and credibility to acts that should have been impossible. The ledger's dust and wear suggest years of disuse, yet its presence alone is enough to indict a system that never fully corrected itself, choosing instead to move forward without looking too closely at what it left behind. The emotional weight of this discovery is intensified by the gap between paper and flesh. Patsy Minkins is not an abstraction or a statistic. She is a living person whose daily suffering continues while her name lies flattened into ink. The ledger reduces her to an entry, a line item that strips away voice, fear, and hope, and this reduction mirrors the way society at large treats her continued bondage. By existing simultaneously as a free person under the law and as property in practice, Patsy occupies a liminal space where her humanity is acknowledged in theory and denied in reality. The ledger captures this contradiction perfectly, freezing it in place for anyone willing to read closely enough. This key point also establishes the theme of complicity through bureaucracy. No single villain needs to be present in the room for injustice to persist. Clerks who copied old formats, officials who failed to revise procedures, and leaders who prioritized stability over moral clarity all contribute to the same outcome. The ledger becomes a symbol of how evil can survive through paperwork, how cruelty can be maintained not only by whips and chains, but by forms, columns, and signatures. It shows that oppression does not always require active violence. Sometimes it only needs passive continuation. The faded ink further suggests the passage of time and the ease with which uncomfortable truths are allowed to blur. As the letters soften and the pages weaken, so too does the collective memory of those still trapped by outdated systems. The ledger waits patiently, knowing that history often favors declarations over follow-through. Its rediscovery threatens that comfort, forcing the present to confront evidence that freedom was unevenly applied and selectively enforced. In this sense, the ledger is not merely a record of the past, but a mirror held up to the present, asking whether justice delayed by indifference is any different from justice denied. The second key point unfolds not through documents or official discovery, but through sound, rumor, and the uneasy movement of fear across a city that claims it has nothing left to hide. Whispers begin where facts refuse to surface, passing from mouth to mouth in half, finished sentences, lowered voices, and glances that never quite settle. In Louisville, the story spreads unevenly, changing shape as it goes. Some say there is a woman kept beneath a shop. Others insist she is cared for, protected from a dangerous world she would not survive alone. And a few refuse to repeat the tale at all, as if naming it might make them responsible for what it reveals. The lack of clarity is part of the cruelty, because uncertainty allows everyone to choose the version that troubles them least. These whispers expose a deeper truth about how bondage survives after abolition, not through open force, but through collective avoidance. Chains are no longer visible, so they are replaced by silence, and silence becomes stronger than iron. Neighbors hear sounds through the walls at night, a cough held too long, footsteps pacing where no one is supposed to live, but each sound is quickly rationalized. It is easy to convince oneself that the noises belong to storage shifting, rats moving through wood, or simply the imagination. The rumor of a hidden woman becomes something unpleasant but distant, a curiosity rather than a call to action. In this way, the city participates in her captivity without ever laying hands on her. The language of the whispers matters because it reflects how oppression is softened when spoken indirectly. People do not say enslaved, they say kept. They do not say imprisoned, they say sheltered. These euphemisms drain urgency from the truth, transforming violence into arrangement and cruelty into necessity. By the time the story reaches the ears of those who might intervene, it has been dulled by repetition, stripped of its sharpest edges. What remains is a vague discomfort, easily dismissed in a city eager to see itself as reformed. The rumor survives precisely because it is incomplete, allowing listeners to feel informed without feeling obligated. For Patsy Minkins, the whispers are both a curse and a fragile thread of hope. She cannot hear them clearly, but she senses their existence in the way people move above her, in the sudden pauses when strangers visit, in the tension that enters the house like a cold draft. The knowledge that she is being talked about, even incorrectly, means she is not entirely erased. Yet the whispers do nothing to loosen the door or lift the weight of isolation. They hover outside her reach, proof that awareness alone does not equal rescue. The city knows enough to feel uneasy, but not enough to act. This turning point reveals the role of community in sustaining injustice. It is not just officials or owners who keep Patsy hidden, but ordinary people who decide that knowing too much would demand too much. Some fear retaliation, others fear embarrassment, and many simply fear disrupting the fragile order of their daily lives. The whispers allow them to acknowledge the wrong while postponing responsibility indefinitely. As long as the story remains unofficial, it can be ignored without consequence. There is also a haunting intimacy to the idea of a hidden woman in a familiar place. The cellar is not a distant plantation or an abstract symbol of the past, but a space beneath a working shop, surrounded by commerce, conversation, and routine. This proximity forces the city's moral failure into close quarters. Freedom is being bought and sold above ground, while bondage persists below, separated by little more than a floor. The whispers carry this discomfort, threading it through taverns, markets, and parlors, making it impossible to fully forget, even if no one dares to confirm. As the rumors grow, they begin to change the atmosphere of Louisville itself. Trust thins, conversations falter, and people measure their words more carefully. Everyone senses that something is wrong, but no one wants to be the first to say it plainly. The city becomes a place where truth exists only in fragments, scattered across conversations that never quite connect. This fragmentation mirrors Patsy's own existence, split between legal freedom and lived captivity. The power of this key point lies in its demonstration that injustice does not require universal agreement, only sufficient hesitation. The whispers show how evil adapts to new conditions, learning to survive in the gaps between certainty and doubt. By the time the truth threatens to surface, it has already been buried under layers of rumor, denial, and fear, making it harder to unearth than if it had been openly declared from the start. The third key point shifts the story from rumor into evidence, and with that shift comes danger, because proof threatens comfort in a way whispers never can. The journalist enters quietly, not as a hero announced by trumpets, but as a patient observer drawn to inconsistencies that refuse to align. He notices how certain names repeat in public records, how meetings end abruptly when particular topics surface, how the past is spoken of with rehearsed certainty rather than reflection. His work begins with curiosity, but curiosity hardens into suspicion when he discovers a bundle of letters misfiled among routine correspondence. Their paper brittle, their seals broken long ago, their contents never meant to be revisited. These letters do not describe violence directly. They do not need to. Instead, they reveal knowledge, and knowledge is the most damning element of all. Officials write to one another in careful language, acknowledging that certain individuals remain in conditions that no longer align with the law. They discuss timing, optics, and inconvenience, weighing moral responsibility against political stability. In their words, Patsy Minkins is not named often, but she exists as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be freed. The tone is calm, administrative, and disturbingly rational, exposing how injustice becomes normalized when framed as a logistical concern. The journalist understands immediately what these letters represent. They are not accusations shouted from the margins, but confirmations whispered from the center. They prove that those entrusted with enforcing freedom chose delay, silence, and omission instead. This realization alters the stakes of his work, because exposing private knowledge implicates not just individuals, but an entire structure that depends on forgetfulness. The letters show that the failure was not one of ignorance but of will, and that distinction transforms negligence into betrayal. As he reads, the journalist feels the weight of proximity to power. Each signature belongs to a man respected in public, praised for guiding the city through transition. These are not caricatures of villains, but architects of normalcy, people whose reputations rest on calm leadership and measured restraint. The letters reveal how restraint can become cruelty when it prioritizes order over justice. By choosing not to act, these officials allowed old practices to persist under new names, trusting that time would bury what courage refused to confront. The danger intensifies as the journalist realizes the letters were hidden intentionally, not destroyed, but misplaced just enough to escape casual discovery. This suggests a belief that history could be managed through filing cabinets. That truth could be neutralized by obscurity. The act of hiding rather than erasing reflects confidence in public apathy, a calculated assumption that no one would look closely once the declarations of freedom had been made. The journalist's discovery threatens that assumption, and with it, the fragile peace built on selective memory. Emotionally, this moment is heavy with moral clarity and personal risk. Publishing these letters would not only expose wrongdoing, but also challenge the city's preferred narrative of progress. The journalist understands that doing so could cost him access, safety, and livelihood. Friends warn him gently, suggesting that reopening old wounds benefits no one. Others remind him that the law has already moved on, implying that revisiting unfinished business is an act of needless provocation. These reactions echo the same logic found in the letters, reinforcing how deeply entrenched the habit of avoidance has become. What makes this key point especially powerful is its connection back to Patsy Minkins herself. While she remains confined, her existence debated in ink and policy, men who have never met her decide her fate through delay. The journalist begins to see her not only as a victim of one household, but as a casualty of collective cowardice. The letters turn her suffering into a consequence of deliberate inaction, binding her story to every official who chose patience over principle. This realization fuels the journalist's resolve, transforming his work from reporting into reckoning. The uncovering of the letters also reframes the earlier whispers, revealing them as symptoms rather than causes. Rumor existed because truth had been suppressed, and silence thrived because accountability had been postponed. With evidence in hand, the journalist recognizes that the city's unease was not accidental but engineered, a byproduct of leadership that relied on ambiguity to maintain control. The letters strip away that ambiguity, replacing it with clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing that can no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding. This turning point deepens the story's tension by introducing the possibility of consequence. Knowledge alone is no longer enough. It demands response. The journalist stands at the threshold between exposure and erasure, aware that once the truth enters the public sphere, it cannot be easily contained. The letters pulse with quiet urgency, their ink carrying the voices of men who believed their decisions would fade with time. Instead, those decisions now wait to be dragged into the light, threatening to unravel the careful illusion that freedom, once declared, had truly been delivered. The fourth key point brings the tension out of paper and rumor and forces it into motion. Through Patsy Minkins' attempted escape, an act that fractures the fragile balance the city has maintained through denial. For years, her captivity has relied on stillness, on the assumption that she will endure quietly and invisibly. The escape shatters that assumption and exposes how many lives have been arranged around her confinement. It begins not with hope, but with exhaustion, the slow accumulation of days that refuse to change until fear becomes less powerful than the certainty of remaining where she is. Patsy does not plan heroically or dramatically. She listens, watches, and memorizes patterns, learning the rhythm of the house above her the way others learn the seasons. She knows when deliveries arrive, when footsteps linger, when silence means sleep rather than absence. Her body carries the memory of every locked door and every moment of restraint, and when she finally moves, it is not toward freedom as an abstract idea, but toward air, space, and the chance to exist without permission. This grounded motivation makes her attempt deeply human, driven by survival rather than symbolism. The moment she tries to flee, the city's hidden machinery activates. Neighbors who have long avoided clarity suddenly become participants, whether they intend to or not. Someone hears a sound out of place, someone else notices a door ajar, and information begins to travel faster than the earlier whispers ever did. Fear spreads alongside it, because an escape threatens exposure. If Patsy is seen, if she speaks, if she reaches anyone willing to listen, the carefully maintained illusion collapses. The same people who once chose silence now feel compelled to act, revealing how quickly neutrality turns into enforcement when comfort is at risk. What emerges is a network not formally organized but emotionally aligned. A shopkeeper delays her path with questions disguised as concern. A passerby recognizes something wrong but looks away, calculating consequences in the space of a breath. Others alert authorities under the guise of maintaining order, convincing themselves they are preventing chaos rather than returning a woman to captivity. Each action feels small and justifiable in isolation, but together they form a web that tightens around her. The escape exposes how oppression survives through ordinary decisions made by ordinary people who believe they are protecting themselves. The language used during this moment is revealing. Patsy is described as confused, unstable, or ungrateful, labels that strip credibility from her fear and urgency. These words travel faster than the truth, preparing the ground for her recapture by framing it as correction rather than violence. By the time she is found, the narrative has already been shaped, allowing those involved to see themselves as reasonable rather than complicit. The city absorbs the disruption by reasserting familiar roles, restoring the surface of normalcy at the cost of her freedom. Emotionally, this turning point is devastating because it demonstrates how close freedom can be without ever becoming real. Patsy experiences movement, open space, and the possibility of being seen, only to have those sensations weaponized against her. The attempt leaves her more isolated than before, as any lingering doubt about her situation is replaced by reinforced control. Her captors adjust their methods, becoming quieter, more cautious, and more confident that the system around them will protect their interests. The failure of the escape teaches them that they are not alone. At the same time, the escape changes something irreversible within the city. Even though Patsy is returned, the event leaves a residue of fear and awareness that cannot be fully erased. People know now, not just vaguely but concretely, that a woman tried to run because she was being held against her will. This knowledge unsettles the earlier comfort of ambiguity. Some double down on denial, insisting it was a misunderstanding, while others begin to feel the weight of having acted against their conscience. The city fractures along these emotional lines, revealing fault lines that were always present but never tested. This key point also deepens the moral stakes for those already aware of the truth, particularly the journalist and anyone who has seen the letters. The escape confirms that the injustice is not theoretical or historical, but immediate and ongoing. Patsy's physical movement becomes evidence that cannot be dismissed as rumor or paperwork. Her body, her fear, and her determination confront the city with the cost of its inaction, transforming abstract guilt into lived consequence. The attempted escape ultimately exposes the lie that systems collapse only under great pressure. In reality, they are held together by countless small choices made in moments like this, when individuals decide whether to intervene, ignore, or assist. Patsy's failure to escape does not mark the end of resistance, but the moment when the city's shared responsibility becomes undeniable, because from that point on, no one involved can claim they did not know, and no one can pretend that silence is the same as innocence. The fifth key point forces the story into its final and most uncomfortable shape, where revelation no longer belongs to individuals but presses itself onto the entire city, demanding an answer that cannot be delayed or delegated. What emerges is not a single dramatic confession, but a slow, undeniable convergence of truth. The ledger, the whispers, the letters, and the failed escape no longer exist as separate threads. They align into a single narrative that strips Louisville of its practiced innocence. The city is confronted not with the question of whether Patsy Minkins was wronged, but with the deeper accusation that freedom itself was selectively honored, protected by words while violated by action. This confrontation does not arrive cleanly. Officials hesitate, weighing responses that will preserve authority while minimizing damage. Statements are drafted and redrafted, careful to acknowledge concern without admitting guilt. Some argue that revisiting the matter threatens social order, that reopening wounds from the past will only inflame tensions better left to settle. Others insist that legality has already moved forward, and that what happened in the margins should not be allowed to overshadow progress. These defenses echo earlier justifications, revealing how power clings to delay even when delay is no longer possible. Public reaction fractures along familiar lines. Some citizens feel betrayed, not only by the exposure of continued bondage, but by the realization that they were asked to celebrate a freedom that had never fully existed. Others respond with anger toward those who uncovered the truth, accusing them of stirring unrest and exaggerating isolated incidents. Patsy herself becomes a symbol argued over, rather than a woman listened to, her suffering interpreted through competing narratives designed to protect reputations, rather than restore dignity. The debate exposes how easily moral outrage can be redirected away from its source. What makes this moment inescapable is the collapse of plausible denial. The evidence is too layered, too consistent, to be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. The ledger proves institutional failure, the letters prove conscious awareness, and the escape proves lived reality. Together, they leave no space for neutrality. Silence now becomes an active choice rather than a passive one, and the cost of that choice becomes visible. Those who once believed themselves uninvolved must now reckon with how their comfort depended on another's captivity. For Patsy Minkins, this reckoning arrives unevenly. Her fate is discussed in rooms she will never enter, shaped by people who speak of justice as an abstract principle rather than a necessity. Even as the city debates its conscience, she remains trapped within the consequences of its hesitation. This imbalance sharpens the story's central question, whether acknowledgement without repair is merely another form of cruelty. The city may finally see her, but seeing does not automatically translate into saving. The revelation also reshapes how Louisville understands itself. The narrative of clean transformation collapses, replaced by a more unsettling truth that progress was partial and conditional. Freedom was proclaimed, but only enforced where it aligned with existing power. This realization stains every celebration that came before it, casting doubt on the sincerity of past declarations. The city is forced to recognize that its identity has been built not just on what it overcame, but on what it chose to overlook. This key point underscores that justice delayed becomes justice distorted. By waiting, by negotiating, by prioritizing appearance over action, the city allowed harm to deepen and spread. The consequences are no longer limited to Patsy alone, but extend to the moral fabric of the community. Children grow up within a lie, officials inherit compromised authority, and faith in law erodes as people realize it can be bent by convenience. The cost of maintaining the illusion of freedom proves higher than the cost of confronting its absence. As the truth settles, it leaves behind an irreversible question rather than a resolution. Can a society claim freedom if it failed to protect the most vulnerable when it mattered most? Is acknowledgement meaningful without accountability? Does progress count if it requires forgetting those left behind? These questions linger over Louisville, refusing to be answered quickly or comfortably, because they expose a truth more frightening than any single act of cruelty: that evil does not always announce itself, and that the greatest danger lies not in what a society does wrong, but in what it allows to continue once it knows better. The end does not arrive with spectacle. There is no sudden rush of justice, no clean moment where the city redeems itself and walks away lighter. Instead, the conclusion settles like dust after a collapse, slow and unavoidable. Under mounting pressure, with evidence now too visible to bury, officials are forced to act not because they have grown brave, but because continued inaction threatens to expose them further. Patsy Minkins is brought into the open at last, blinking in daylight that feels almost unreal, her body bearing the quiet testimony of years that should not have existed. Freedom, when it finally reaches her, is imperfect and late. It arrives wrapped in conditions, supervision, and public scrutiny, as though her suffering has made her suspect rather than wronged. She is spoken to gently, but watched closely, offered assistance that feels like another form of control. The city congratulates itself cautiously, framing her release as proof that the system works, ignoring the fact that it worked only after it failed for far too long. Patsy listens to these conversations with a distant calm, understanding that the word free does not erase memory or restore what was taken. Those responsible face consequences that feel measured rather than just. Some resign quietly, others are reassigned, and a few manage to outlast the outrage entirely. No punishment matches the weight of what was allowed to happen, but the exposure leaves marks that cannot be fully scrubbed away. The ledger is removed from its shelf and locked away, the letters archived with care, no longer hidden but still rarely discussed. History is adjusted, not corrected, revised just enough to acknowledge error without fully absorbing blame. Louisville moves forward, because cities always do. Shops reopen, boats continue down the river, and children grow up hearing a softened version of the story. Yet something lingers beneath the routine, an unease that surfaces whenever freedom is spoken of too proudly. People remember, even if they pretend not to, that liberty once existed only on paper, while a woman breathed in darkness beneath their feet. That knowledge becomes a quiet inheritance, passed down through glances and unfinished sentences. As for Patsy, her life does not become easy, but it becomes her own. She walks without permission, chooses when to speak and when to remain silent, and learns that survival itself can be a form of defiance. The city never fully knows what to do with her presence because she embodies a truth it would rather keep abstract. She is living proof that freedom delayed is freedom denied, and that declarations mean little without courage to enforce them. In the end, there is no final verdict that cleanses the past. There is only recognition, uncomfortable and incomplete. That justice is not a moment but a responsibility, and that the most dangerous injustices are those committed not in secrecy, but in full view of people who choose to look away